Welcome to Warfare Codex. If you enjoy fascinating and unusual history, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more incredible stories. Now, let's dive into the strange and extraordinary world of history's most unique individuals. The year was 1914, and Europe was on the brink of a catastrophic event, one that would change the world forever. At the time, most people could not have imagined that a single assassination would set in motion a chain of events leading to one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. Tensions had been building across Europe for decades, fueled by a complex mix of alliances, military buildups, and the growing nationalist sentiment that was sweeping across the continent. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, was the spark that ignited the powder keg of Europe. The assassin, a Bosnian Serb nationalist named Gavrilo Princip, was acting out of a desire to free Slavic people from the grip of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. While the assassination itself may have been a single act of violence, it set off a deadly cascade of actions that soon involved many of Europe's most powerful nations. Austria-Hungary, enraged by the killing, declared war on Serbia. Russia, which had strong ties to Serbia, began to mobilize its forces in response. Germany, allied with Austria-Hungary, declared war on Russia, and soon after, France found itself drawn into the conflict as part of its alliance with Russia. Germany, fearing a two-front war, quickly invaded Belgium as a route to attack France. This violation of Belgian neutrality led Britain to declare war on Germany. What started as a localized conflict between two Balkan nations quickly escalated into a global war. By the summer of 1914, much of Europe had been divided into two armed camps. The Central Powers, consisting of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, and the Allied Powers, which included France, Britain, Russia, and later the United States, among others. This marked the beginning of what would come to be known as the First World War, or World War I. The war was expected to be short. Many believed it would be a matter of weeks, perhaps months, before a decisive victory was achieved. However, they could not have been more wrong. What followed was an unimaginable level of bloodshed, destruction, and suffering, a conflict that would stretch on for 4 long years. The nature of war itself was changing. The Industrial Revolution, with its innovations in technology, meant that both sides had access to new and deadly weapons that would forever alter the landscape of battle. The machine gun, for example, could mow down soldiers by the hundreds in seconds, while the artillery, massive guns that fired explosive shells at long distances, had the ability to wipe out entire battalions with a single barrage. The most significant change came on the Western Front, where the war quickly devolved into a stalemate. Both sides dug in, creating miles of trenches across the landscape from the North Sea to the Swiss border. These trenches became the soldiers' homes, a miserable existence that was marked by constant bombardment, unspeakable living conditions, and the ever-present threat of death. The trenches were filled with mud, rats, lice, and disease, and soldiers had little protection from the constant shelling that rained down upon them. The soldiers were trapped, unable to move forward, while new technology like machine guns and barbed wire made advancing virtually impossible. Trench warfare was grinding and indescribably brutal. Days and nights were spent in constant fear as the sounds of artillery shells, rifle fire, and the screams of the wounded echoed through the air. Soldiers lived in constant uncertainty, not knowing when they would be ordered to go over the top and face near certain death as they charged across the battlefield. The futility of war became apparent, with thousands of men dying over mere yards of territory that were often retaken and lost again in the next wave. In the trenches, soldiers faced more than just the enemy. They were also up against nature itself. Cold, rain, and mud often turned the trenches into flooded, disease-ridden hellholes. Trench foot, a condition caused by prolonged exposure to cold, wet conditions, often led to amputation. Malnutrition, dysentery, and the spread of typhus made life in the trenches unbearable. Rats, which were drawn to the decaying corpses scattered across the battlefield, became one of the most feared aspects of trench life. These rats carried disease, and soldiers had to constantly battle them for their food and supplies. Then came the gas. In 1915, the Germans first used chlorine gas against French forces, marking a horrifying new chapter in the war. Gas attacks would become a terrifying weapon on the battlefield. Unlike conventional weapons, gas was invisible, silent, and deadly. Soldiers would be exposed to the toxic fumes without warning, and those who survived were often left permanently scarred. The gas caused suffocation, blinding, and burning of the skin. The development of gas masks offered some protection, but the threat of gas attacks was always present. It added another layer of horror to the already unimaginable conditions. The war continued, and both sides threw everything they had into the conflict. One of the most famous battles of the war was the Battle of the Somme, which began in July 1916. The British launched an offensive with the goal of breaking through German lines, but the results were catastrophic. On the first day alone, the British suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, the most devastating single day in the history of the British Army. Over the course of the battle, which lasted for months, more than 1 million men would be killed, wounded, or missing. Yet, the front lines barely moved. The battle epitomized the futility and horror of trench warfare. The carnage on the Western Front was mirrored on the Eastern Front, where the Russian Empire faced off against the German and Austro-Hungarian forces. The sheer scale of the war in the East, with massive battles fought across vast open landscapes, added another layer of devastation to the conflict. However, the war in the East was marked by even more severe losses, as the Russian army suffered from inadequate equipment, poor leadership, and the breakdown of morale. Eventually, the Russian Revolution of 1917 would lead to the collapse of the Russian Empire, and Russia would withdraw from the war, leaving the Germans with the opportunity to focus their efforts on the Western Front. By 1917, the war had become an all-consuming global struggle. Nations from around the world were drawn into the conflict. In Africa, German colonies came under attack by British and French forces. In the Middle East, the British and their Arab allies fought the Ottoman Empire. In the Pacific, Japan seized German territories. The war was no longer confined to Europe. It had truly become a world war. As 1917 continued, the war began to show signs of changing course. The introduction of new forces and the exhaustion of the European powers led to a shift in momentum, but it also revealed the staggering cost of the conflict. By this point, the war had claimed millions of lives, and both sides were stretched to their limits. The Allied powers, France, Britain, and Russia, were all struggling to maintain their positions, while the Central Powers, particularly Germany and Austria-Hungary, were also finding it increasingly difficult to continue their campaigns. In April 1917, the United States, led by President Woodrow Wilson, entered the war, tipping the balance in favor of the Allies. The decision to join the war came after Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare and sank several American ships, and after the interception of the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany attempted to encourage Mexico to attack the United States. The addition of the United States' military strength, resources, and morale boost was a game-changer for the exhausted Allies. While the United States' arrival brought a new sense of hope, it also marked the beginning of the end for the Central Powers. The Allied powers, bolstered by fresh supplies and American troops, launched a series of offensives that began to break the deadlock. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the collapse of Russia became increasingly inevitable. The Russian Revolution of 1917 led to the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II and the rise of the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin. In March 1918, Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, effectively exiting the war. With the withdrawal of Russia, Germany was able to shift its focus entirely to the Western Front. However, by the time the Germans launched their spring offensives in 1918, they were already exhausted, and the outcome of the war was increasingly uncertain. The German military, which had fought fiercely on multiple fronts for nearly 4 years, was beginning to crack under the strain. In their final push, the Germans made some initial gains, but they soon faced fierce resistance from the combined forces of France, Britain, and the fresh American troops arriving in large numbers. The Allied counteroffensives, particularly the 100 Days Offensive, pushed the Germans back across a wide front. By the fall of 1918, the Central Powers were in full retreat. The Allies, now receiving a steady flow of fresh American troops and supplies, advanced rapidly. German forces, demoralized and worn out, were no longer able to maintain their positions. On November 9, 1918, the German Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated, and the new German government asked for an armistice. The war was effectively over. At 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918, the fighting ceased. After 4 years of intense conflict, the Great War came to an end, leaving behind an unprecedented death toll. Over 10 million soldiers had lost their lives, with an additional 20 million wounded, many suffering injuries that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The war had ravaged Europe. Whole regions were destroyed, cities reduced to rubble, and the infrastructure of nations shattered. The loss of life and destruction on such a scale was unimaginable, and the war's aftermath left Europe deeply fractured and unstable. While the war officially ended, the consequences of World War I continued to shape the world for decades to come. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, formally ended the war and imposed harsh penalties on Germany. The country was required to take full responsibility for the war, pay massive reparations, and lose large portions of its territory. These harsh terms would create deep resentment among the German population, laying the groundwork for the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in the 1930s. World War I had also led to the collapse of several empires. The Austro-Hungarian Empire disintegrated, and new nations were created in its place, including Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The Ottoman Empire dissolved, giving rise to new nations like Turkey, and paving the way for the Middle East to become a region of intense geopolitical struggle. The Russian Empire was replaced by the Soviet Union, a new communist state that would become a major player in the coming Cold War. The war also had profound social consequences. Women, who had been employed in a variety of roles during the war, began to gain more rights and freedoms, most notably the right to vote in many countries. The war had changed society in fundamental ways, from the role of women in the workforce to the rise of totalitarian ideologies in the years that followed. In the midst of all this chaos, there were still moments of extraordinary bravery. Sergeant Alvin York, an American soldier, became a hero after capturing 132 German soldiers in a daring raid. Manfred von Richthofen, better known as the Red Baron, became a legendary figure in the skies, achieving over 80 aerial victories before his death. Soldiers on both sides exhibited extraordinary courage and selflessness, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The heroes of World War I became symbols of the human spirit, enduring hardship in the face of unimaginable horror. However, for the vast majority of soldiers, the war was a deep and lasting trauma. The psychological effects of the conflict were far-reaching, and many men who survived returned home with the scars of war, both physical and mental. The term shell shock was coined to describe the psychological toll of war, and later became known as PTSD. The soldiers of World War I, who had survived the horrors of trench warfare, would struggle to reintegrate into a world that could never truly understand their suffering. By the time the war ended, Europe had been irrevocably changed. Empires had fallen, borders had shifted, and new political ideologies had begun to take root. The war's devastating effects were felt worldwide, shaping the future for generations to come. World War I was more than just a military conflict. It was the beginning of a new era. It marked the end of the old world order and the beginning of the modern world, a world forever marked by the memories of the Great War. Thanks for watching Warfare Codex. If you enjoyed this journey into history's strangest figures, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more amazing stories. See you in the next one.